All right. So, everybody, hi again. My name is Anthony Rivera Strain. I am the host and moderator of the Crowdsource Politics podcast. We are a podcast born out of a funky little debate community on the funky little Facebook debate community. And we decided to do a podcast about 2 years ago with some of the admins, and we've been doing it ever since. We try to release an episode on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month when time allows. So that's generally what we do. The topic today is, has the left gone too far in its quest to attain racial justice in the United States, particularly in the United States? And it is of my opinion that we have not. Oh, looks like we just got a sub. But it is of my opinion that it has not gone far enough. Not only has it gone, hasn't gone too far, it hasn't gone far enough. And particularly in the realm of economic justice. If we were to look into the past, the United States, the amount of economic oppression that Black people have experienced since this country's founding is immeasurable. It wasn't until, and this is a conservative estimate, it wasn't until about the 1980s where Black people were even fully allowed to buy homes in any community within the United States without going through some sort of shenanigans. Now, has things gotten better? Sure. I think everybody can agree with that. Even the most probably radical nationalist or leftist can probably affirm that things have, in fact, gotten better. But with that said, everything can get even better, and there's still a ton of room for improvement. Looking at things like income disparity, wealth disparity, and that sort of stuff can all be traced back to America's oppression of Black people in various forms, either culturally or officially through laws. For example, for a law example, we have the obvious of segregation in the South, where Black people were segregated into different communities, not allowed to eat at the same tables as white people and that sort of thing, which made it impossible socially to build the kind of relationships required in order to have social capital. And social capital is immensely important, developing relationships and being able to find people that might take your business idea and want to run with it. And it builds on those sort of things. That can be seen through giant examples such as the Tulsa riots. Well, I should say Tulsa massacre. Calling it a riot is not really what it was. Basically, a bunch of white people went through and killed a ton of Black people and destroyed what was then called Black Wall Street. Amount of wealth that we can begin to quantify it, but of course have not. With that, my closing statement is done. Opening statement, my mistake.
Okay, so for all of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Idavaya. I am a Facebook person. I have a group called the Political Paradigm Shift. I have a podcast.
Hold on, I still can't hear you.
Oh, God damn it.
I don't know why this is happening.
Do you think by turning my thing down?
No. I think it's not from that. Hold on. It might just be misreading Heather's comments. Hold on. I am so sorry, everybody. Okay, you can hear Nick. Please say you can hear Nick. Like, type that out for me.
Can you hear me?
It's going to take a second for it to give it. Okay, thank you, Heather. I am sorry. Okay, so they can hear you guys now. Please continue, Nick. Sorry about this, everybody. Technical difficulties is usually why we start late. So I'm still learning.
Okay, so in any event, I don't know what people heard or what it didn't, but my name is Nick Idavaya. I have a group called the Political Paradigm Shift. I have a podcast with the same name. It's we're on a temporary break because of various drama, and in any event, so the title of the debate was, has the left gone too far in its quest to eradicate racism? Right. And when Anthony initially posted this, there were multiple comments on the page. One of them was, how could you possibly go too far? Right. If your goal is something like racial equality or justice. And so my argument here is just sort of a simple one to that specific statement. Just because the origin of racial justice is noble does not make all actions to achieve that objective also noble. So in other words, if I ran into a grocery store and I, blew it up or something and said, this is in the name of racial justice, right? Does that also make my action okay? Does that legitimize everything I do because I start with a noble rationale, right? And I feel like every pro-life argument could also be rationalized with that same justification. So that's just I just wanted to throw that out there to start out. I really think that it's important that people know that. I also want to point out that there needs to be some sort of rationale for accusing people of racism. So I think we've probably all, even people on the left, right, have been accused of racism on various occasions for ridiculous things, right? And things that weren't even related to racism, but it's often utilized by other left people on the left to try to discredit you. So that's another example of how people go too far. And obviously, I could get into specifics. I have lots of them, but I won't for the sake of time. In terms of the United States, and I know that Anthony went through some of the historical stuff. Obviously, the United States has a long history of racism, slavery. We could argue on the specifics, but genocide against Native Americans, other forms of discrimination. I would not think that is the same thing as saying the United States is based in racism, because I think it's actually the opposite. I think the principles, right, that were outlined in the Constitution, barring a couple of examples, right, are the things that actually allowed us to evolve out of racism. So those include freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom of the press, right? Stuff like that. During the civil rights movement, when Martin Luther King gave his great speech, he talked about the promissory note, right, from America, and basically stated that America had defaulted on it, right? Not that the American principles didn't meet it, that they hadn't followed through with it. So the principles were there, but the country wasn't. And so I think that it's good to make that distinction when anytime you're sort of evaluating America and racism. As of current modern day America, this is an excerpt I took out of a National Review article, everybody's favorite outlet. But I think it really makes my point here. So it says the U.S. has a massive multi-billion-dollar apparatus that exists to identify and eliminate systemic, structural, institutional, and individual discrimination. That apparatus has existed for more than a half a century and continues to expand. It consists of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the FBI, to enforce that, the state civil rights commissions, local human rights commissions, state's attorney general, and tens of thousands of investigators, enforcement, and compliance officers, local prosecutors, and private attorneys who enforce a sprawling framework of civil rights and equal opportunity laws. These laws include, but are not limited to, Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Sections 1981, 1982, and 1983, of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1871, the 14th, 15th Amendments, the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, and thousands of state and local equal opportunity and anti-discrimination laws. This mammoth regime doesn't even include the tens of thousands of human resource officers and diversity and inclusion personnel who guard against systemic and structural racism within their respective institutions. And that's the end of it. Any one of us.
Nick, if you could wrap up
Sure.
your opening statement.
Sure. I have lots more to say, Bill. I didn't even get to my 5 points.
You're going to get the chance.
Give me 2 minutes. Give me 2 minutes.
Okay, right. Anthony took 3. You're already. He
can have extra time.
I think we should let we both agreed for Bill to be the moderator, so there wouldn't be any bias. So I would be
Okay.
more along the lines of what Bill is saying here, not
Okay.
not to be a dick or anything.
Okay, that's fine. Bill,
You will get your chance to say your piece. You still have your closing statement, and we still have all our questions. So actually, what you just said, Nick. Oh, by the way, this is Bill Boswell. Everybody, I understand you couldn't hear my introduction. The format of this debate is thus. There's going to be an opening statement from each of our participants. You just heard those. Then there'll be a series of questions, which will have timed responses in the interest of fairness. We had a coin flip, also in the interest of fairness, that decided who was going to start. And after our debate, we'll have a time for closing statements. And Nick, you will have the time to say your piece. So with that, your introduction, Nick, actually was a great introduction to the first question. Who decides when racial injustice has ended? Anthony, to you.
Well, I guess the correct answer, quote unquote, would be the people that are currently oppressed. So when an oppressed people feel as though that they are no longer oppressed, then we have achieved racial equality. And I think that is pretty much a fair statement to make. While we can argue about maybe specifics, instances of maybe somebody misunderstood a comment made, or intent wasn't taken into account, or what have you, on any individual level, we are talking about a macro level here. We're not talking about micro levels here. We're talking about how people see their group being reflected and accepted within a polity. So when the majority of said group feels as though they are no longer oppressed, then they are no longer oppressed.
Excellent. And to you, Nick.
so I think that's a super complicated question, and it would depend on how you define racism. And I don't necessarily know if we could answer that. I would have to be given a specific definition of what you think racism is, or how we're defining it here. On a systemic level, racism, right, as itself might be different. I argued, if I had more time, I would have argued that racism and inequality aren't necessarily the same thing. Meaning that racial animus isn't necessarily driving inequality, not on a conscious level, that it's not an intentional conspiratorial thing being handed down by the government as we speak, but more of a sort of consequence of years of what was intentional racism. And so I think that it's really hard to answer, and I don't think I'm qualified to answer it.
Fair enough. It is a complicated question, and you both did a great job with your answers. And that kind of leads to the next question. Yes, sir.
Just for clarity of how the format is. So are you just going to rattle off a bunch of questions, or are we going to be able to respond to how we each addressed a point?
Go ahead if you'd like to address Nick's points.
No, I just, for the next couple of questions, if we could get a couple of, like, maybe a minute or two to address each other, just so there's more back and forth, that would be great. Unless Nick is opposed.
Yes, sir.
I don't care. No.
Okay.
Sounds like you have something to say, Anthony. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go to the next question.
Okay, next question. Good with you, Nick?
Oh, yes, I'm good.
Excellent. All right, the next question is this. Is it possible to unravel systemic racial injustice in a Eurocentric culture such as the United States? Nick, you had the last word on the last question. Anthony, this one to you.
I can do the last word. Nick can go first. We can go back and forth like that. I'm good with that.
Excellent. Nick, on to you.
I don't understand the question.
The United States of America is a Eurocentric culture.
Okay.
In the United States of America, there is racial injustice. Is it possible to end racial injustice in a Eurocentric culture?
Again, I mean, ending racial injustice is a very subjective thing. And any number of people are going to have any number of definitions of what that means. Certainly, there are problems, systemic problems in society that need to be addressed. My general issue is how the left goes about addressing them, not that they need to be addressed. I should clarify. But I don't know. I don't know how to answer it, just like I didn't know how to answer the first one.
Anthony, to you.
So to correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but the question is it possible to unravel racial inequality or racial injustice in a Eurocentric culture? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The answer is yes. And the reason I say yes is because our culture, while it may be Eurocentric, is not Euro only, if that makes any sense to people listening. The United States is often seen as a melting pot. And the reason that it's seen as a melting pot is because people from all over the world, their cultures they bring their cultures here, they bring their beliefs, they bring their ideas, and they kind of Americanize to a degree. And what that means to me is that the core values, the core American values, which I'm sure Nick would say is probably the focus on what we should be focusing on, things in the Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, being able to protect yourself from people, being able to pursue the American dream. These are all things that everybody in the country, regardless if you're black, white, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, atheist, Christian, what have you, they all pretty much agree on these core tenets. And these core tenets are really what makes America America. But we also have this giant issue with racism in the United States because you could not have slavery, you could not have genocide without othering either of those people or anybody else, unless you had this idea that, white people were superior, that white people were better. And so in order to, and I think the second part of the question was, if so, how, right?
If so, how?
Okay. Yeah, so in order to do that, we have to be able to recognize our past for what it is. Black, the little black spots, the moles, the ugliness, everything. And also how we recognize how things have gone better and what those core values are. That requires a reckoning, especially on race. And that means that we have to be able to go through and quantify just how badly this racial injustice has had an impact on our fellow Americans. And we can do that through things like commissions. We can do that through things like data science. We have redlining, perfect example, right? We have all the maps of redlining. We know how much wealth was transferred from the US government to white people through things like the GI Bill, when black people were just completely not being able to address be able to use it. They couldn't use it for education. They couldn't use it for housing. They were denied being able to go to, the Allentowns. Allentowns had deed restrictions where you had to agree that your property wouldn't be sold to anybody that wasn't white for like 100 years. And it just transferred every time to the next person until they made it illegal to do so. And like I said in my opening statement, these things didn't really end. And if you want to say that they ended, these things didn't end enough is what I should say. If they did, and it wasn't until like 1988 when the last major civil rights lawsuit against housing discrimination was won. And so I'm looking at some of the chats here and stuff, and they've adapted, they've changed. You have people that follow critical race theory, where they say, okay, well, we'll let a few tokens into the situation to like placate the masses, but really the people with money and power are still on top. And who are those people? Those people are white, for the most part. And so you're going to see this like shift as we, with the younger generation, with people my age, Nick's age, and younger. You're going to see people, really being able to take that knowledge and be able to build something up that, you know, maybe in 2 generations we'll say, well, I'll be liberal and say 50 years. In 50 years, where this probably won't be an issue anymore, you know, as like the earliest. And I don't see why we can say that this can't be done, because, as I said, even though we have Eurocentric, we're not Euro only, and we're starting to see that more and more happening more and more.
Excellent. Nick, would you care to respond to Anthony's statements?
So, I'm not entirely sure what he was saying. I think he's correct that anybody who comes to any country is going to have to do some degree of assimilation, and we can certainly debate what that means. I think, you know, forget about Eurocentric. I think America has ideals that and principles and a constitution and laws that everybody has to follow. We can talk about language and stuff like that and how we adapt to that. As far as a commission, I don't really know what that means. I think the point of me reading this little excerpt here was to point out that we have spent we have an entire political party that is fixated on race. We spent an enormous amount of money and time and commissions and departments and all types of stuff evaluating and analyzing racism and data and all that stuff. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue, right? And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, you know, put effort in where it belongs. What it does mean is that we have to have some perspective here, that we're no longer living in 1945, that we're living in 2021, and that racism obviously is still a problem and it still exists, but that it's gotten not just a little bit better, significantly to the point where I think Black poverty in the United States has gone from like 40, it has dropped like 22%, right, since the 1960s. And racism simply isn't acceptable in any part of society. In any job any of us get, we have to go through discrimination training, or for the most part, right? And it's just a part of society where we are essentially, and I don't think this is a bad thing, so I don't mean it to sound that way, forced to, confront these ideas of racism. And it's always anti-racism. There's nothing particularly courageous about not being a racist, right? And I feel like people think there are. It's just what people should be. It's like being against child abuse, right? Who cares, right? You're anti-racist. Good for you. Me too. I just don't think we need to get there by demonizing millions of people, by being forceful, right? In how, or not necessarily forceful, but just lambasting huge portions of the population because they don't necessarily see our ideas as the better ideas. Not necessarily that they don't see them, see it as a problem. They just don't see our approach necessarily being the best approach, or whoever's approach. So I think we need to both recognize that we've come really far, recognize that we have a long way to go in certain areas, and be willing to have a conversation about how we get there from where we're at. Now, that doesn't mean that we, should be compromising with Steve Miller and the MAGA, Vikings that stormed the Capitol. But it does mean that we can have a conversation with libertarians and conservatives and other people who have very reasonable arguments, and to come to without declaring that they're being motivated by some ambiguous form of racism that we define within a conversation. That's it.
Excellent. And whoever's dog that was seems to want to underscore that point. Now, that kind of is a really good segue into the next question. Critical race theory. If you agree with the statement, has the left gone too far in trying to end racial injustice? You'll probably disagree with much of what critical race theory has to offer. If you disagree with that statement, you'll probably agree with critical race theory. So let's ask these two debaters, what do y'all think of critical race theory? And Nick, you're up first.
I'm not actually up first. I think Anthony's up first. I went first last time.
We're doing badminton. So,
my mistake.
it's all good. So as far as critical race theory, I'm going to be honest with everybody. I have not read much in the way of critical race theory. I've read what's come out recently in different media organizations and that sort of thing, but I haven't gotten down into the weeds of some of the first writers and pontificators of what is quote unquote whiteness. I think we all know kind of the gist of what critical race theory is, but I don't think most people actually know the finer details. So with that, as far as whether or not it's right or not, I think we have to probably look at what its core tenets actually are rather than what people think they are. And I think that we need to recognize that, if, and Nick has said this himself, we've still got a long way to go. And so if we still have a long way to go, then maybe we haven't gone far enough in getting to racial justice. I think it's mainly it's a critique on what has become known as quote unquote whiteness. You have it's like what white culture kind of has within these colonial systems, and how much power white people as a collective, and how much they can take the rules, shape the rules of the game to white people's benefit. It's not about individual white people. It's not even necessarily about race, but about the power that comes with that within our system. And if we look at the power structures that be, I mean, sure, we can probably say, it's not a 1-to-1. So a 1-to-1 ratio, you don't expect everybody to necessarily, the end goal the end goal state, and this is what a lot of conservatives get hung up on. The end goal state is as much parity as possible, but conservatives tend to think, well, that means 1-to-1. So if there's, if a country has 13% black people, then 13% of the people that are rich and powerful should be black, and we don't know if that can actually happen. We do know for a fact is that much of what is in the way to this is caused by systems of oppression. And with that, I'll yield.
Excellent. To you, Nick.
So the question is what on critical race theory?
Yeah, so critical race theory is kind of a lightning rod for this sort of debate. If you agree with the statement, has the left gone too far in trying to end racial injustice, you probably would disagree with critical race theory. And conversely, go ahead.
Right. So, I mean, I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it says the view that law is inherently racist, and that law, like not United States law, but just generally law, which I don't understand, is inherently racist, and that race is a social construct that exists to maintain elite interests, which I'm not really sure what they mean by that, because if race is a social construct, then how would we categorize anybody? Or as human beings, we categorize people based on physical and other behavioral characteristics. So I'm not even sure what this means. But the further, when I say go too far, right? What I mean is that that there is way too much premised on this idea of race, that they instead of sort of compartmentalizing it, the issue of race, I think that what they've done is that they've categorized individuals as being specific things based on race, and it's exacerbated the problem. I don't necessarily know if you see what I'm saying, but I think any fixation on this idea of of race, I think worsens the divide, right? So one way they've done this is,
just to clarify, when you say they, are you speaking of the left?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So one example of this would be this usage of the term white privilege, which I find to be statistically, it makes sense. There's definitely a social advantage there, right? But it's sort of like this conversation starter, this issue that people on the left utilize in these conversations, and I think that it's sort of like starting the conversation off with an insult and then expecting the recipient of the information to sort of receive it in this really understanding way, right? Without sort of any context to it. And sort of it's kind of like, well, that's just your white privilege speaking. And so it's sort of like this fallacious argument that people often make. And what that does is it ostracizes lots of people, right? It causes division rather than sort of making, rather than finding a solution. It's like it's almost like that the left has sort of harnessed this self-serving approach, right? That's based on grievance and resentment rather than finding, a solution to the issue. It's about, them holding people accountable and pushing political agendas rather than helping people who need help.
May I respond?
Yes, sir.
So I think part of the disconnect that Nick and I are going to have here is what we're kind of focusing on, and it's part of the question. And while I do agree that there are plenty of people that go too far in their political arguments, we can talk about how the left and right both are kind of trying to vie for power, and how that ends up in the political discourse of the country with vitriol and personal attacks and all that sort of stuff, which we at Crowdsource Politics try to keep as much of a lid on as possible. It's more along the lines of like this conservative kind of argument that if you just stop talking about racism, it will go away. If you don't talk about white privilege, then I don't have to hear about it anymore, and maybe we can just move on and get to a better place. I'm not saying that that's not what Nick is saying here. I'm saying that that's a lot of what the arguments that we see online are about. And anytime that you bring up any kind of racial argument, with white privilege, whiteness, or whatever, people just tune out because they don't want to hear it, right? But they don't want to hear it because they don't want to have to think about it. They don't want to have to examine themselves and where they are, or they may or may not be complicit within this structure that we are talking about of white privilege, of whiteness, of white supremacy, America, whatever, what have you. And they don't want to recognize that because to a lot of people, and I know I'm being broad brushy here, to a lot of people, they 100% are the reason why that they have made anything ever in their life. And if you have to question that, then you have to question somebody's worth. And that's why a lot of this gets shut down. It's because people aren't trying to talk about it in this way. And I think it is up to people like us, the people that are listening to this podcast, or this debate rather, the people participating in it, the people that are more erudite online, that are able to synthesize information and come up with reasonable answers and conclusions. It's up to us to kind of, not in this like elitist way, but try to steer the conversation to a place of normalcy where the fringes get kicked back or whatever, and we can actually get people on the same page of what these terms mean and everything, and then find the solutions from there.
So
excellent.
I think, just to respond, I think it's perfectly, when you're sort of addressing this issue, right? I think you can, that person who's saying, I worked my whole life, I built this, etc. I mean, I think you can address racial inequity without tearing that person's accomplishments down. Like, we can do both at the same time. You don't have to do them separate. And so you don't have to make a person feel like they had some sort of advantage, therefore they got to the place they got. You can say, yeah, I bet you worked hard for that shit. I bet you risked a lot. And this idea of complicity is, again, to me, it's sort of like, you were born, therefore you're complicit. Like, there is no justification to say you're complicit in a system that existed prior to your ability to affect it. And therefore, even without your knowledge, by simply existing as a white person, you have contributed to that. That to me is like the shittiest. It's immoral, right? You're accusing people of being complicit in racist acts by existing as a race beyond their control. It's essentially doing what racism does, right? You're being racist in that moment by saying, because of your race, you're responsible for something, even though they had no participation in it.
Could I also respond to this point?
Of course.
So to address Nick's concern, and this is something that I've seen a lot, and I honestly think it's a misrepresentation, or it's focusing on people that may or may not get it, or whatever. It's this idea that America's original sin is racism, and therefore all white people are born with this original sin of racism and have to fight it. That's not the intention of these conversations. That's not the intention of talking about complicity. The intention of talking about complicity is to bring focus on how these systems interact with one another. And that if you know that these systems are interacting in this way, then if you fail to do anything about it, whether it's posting online, talking to your friends, family, whatever, if you're not doing anything about it, then you become complicit in it, because you're saying, well, I like my life the way it is, and I don't want to do anything to rock the boat. And that's where I think the disconnect comes in these conversations, because people are tending to focus in on this idea, well, you're white, therefore you're evil. And that's not the case at all. Like, period.
Okay, but where does the social responsibility that you're required to do something outside of following the law, providing for yourself and your family, and treating people kindly or without harm? I mean, at what point have we been provided these obligations, and who exactly is the person that's saying we are obligated to do this?
Anthony, respond.
Give me 1 second. There's some chatter in the chat. Okay. So excuse me. It comes from the place of what different people consider to be moral and not moral actions. And if you are a person, you generally here are a person that agrees that racism is a great evil, if you're not doing anything to address it, then you are helping perpetuate it by not trying to stomp it out. And that's where it comes from. Now, and not everybody is capable of, stomping it out. The person that lives in poor Appalachia doesn't have much in terms of power to do anything other than, stop voting for racist pieces of shit. And that's about what they can do, or talk to their families and tell their families to stop talking about stop being racist pieces of shit. And I think that isn't an unfair expectation of people in the United States to do, especially in the year that we're living in, right? It's no longer like culturally accepted to be racist, and I think it should be no longer culturally accepted to tolerate racist people, even if they're your family members.
So
yield.
Yeah. So to follow up, I don't see where this becomes a problem, and where it becomes authoritarian in a sense, in a political movement, is the fact that what you see as a solution to the problem is subjective. So then when people with different views don't and this isn't to even address the fact that you sort of have this idea that people are obligated to do something. Forget about that, because I completely disagree with that. But if they do something, you just don't feel like what they're doing is necessarily the right thing to do. Now, there's really obvious things that aren't right? Like going to like using racist language is obviously not okay, right? And deliberately trying to push for policies that hurt people of color is obviously not okay, right? But because somebody has a different approach to race or racism in the United States, because they think different ideas are better than other ideas, you could easily, with such an ambiguous definition of what it means, apply the term racism to almost anything. And there's like virtually no way to defend, because you're just making it up. Like, you're just saying, look, you're not doing this thing, and this thing, therefore you're a racist, right? To me, that's like, it's you know, and when you take an entire movement and you sort of drive that home, that's where this concept of authoritarian comes from. It's like you're shaming people, you're ostracizing people, in trying to force them into believing what you believe, even if it's not racial animus that's driving them in a different direction. And it's problematic on so many levels, but one of them is you don't know what's driving people. You don't know what drives people in to do what they do. So you're just making these sort of assumptions. Well, if you're not doing this, then that must mean you're starting from this place. And that's problematic. And all it's going to do in the long run is further divide the country. I don't blame people for the actions of other people, right? But I certainly can see the logic in when you have one side or one group in a particular, on the political spectrum, constantly trying to force something down another group's throat, and that other group feeling like they have to defend themselves, right? And all it does is it causes more division. It does not help anything. It's counterproductive.
Well,
Anthony, would you like to respond?
Yeah, and then we can move on to the next question, unless Nick feels like he needs to respond to something else, so we can just go do this back and forth the whole time, which is fine.
Well, we've beat this horse enough, so it is.
Yeah, I
your
only have 10 minutes. I have to go at 3 because it'll get dark here in Rhodey, and I have to go running.
Okay. And then that's fine. So I think this is another hang up that we're talking about here, and I don't really, and this is, you know, people on the left in general seem to think this, really care about intent so much. I care more about actions and consequences. And so when we're talking about all these different things, I think it's important to understand that by failing to call out your family members, if you know they are being racist, or if somebody tells you, hey, this person is doing something that is racist, your boss did something that is racist, maybe you should call them out on it, after explaining it to somebody or whatever, you could probably disagree, but you should probably still bring that up, be like, hey, friend, some people might interpret what you said to be racist, and this is why. And that comes part of the kind of conversation and education of these things, because, you know, maybe they didn't intend to be racist, but it still was interpreted that way. So telling them, hey, this is interpreted.
Hold on one second.
Wait.
And then hold on. And then I want to.
At this point, we got to move on, you guys.
Well, I just want to do one other thing, because it was the authoritarian thing, and I didn't get to address it.
It is your turn, Anthony. Finish it up, and then let's move on to the next one.
So, as far as the authoritarian thing, I don't think it's authoritarian to have these conversations and then yell at each other. Authoritarianism comes from laws. It comes from government. It comes from a political group with some sort of actual power enforcing their will on others, and that isn't really happening. Like we have these, Nick brought it up earlier, these diversity training things and stuff like that, but a lot of those are just check the fucking box. And everybody that's been in the military knows that you do things just because you're told to do it, and everybody just checks out and they do it to say that they did it and then move on, and it doesn't help anything. And I think that's a part of the problem with this, is that a lot of people just, shake their head about it and just be like, oh, well, it's this time again, better check this box and get it over with. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
All right, go.
So wait. Moving on. Moving
Go
on.
ahead.
So badminton back and forth. It was Anthony's. Anthony got the last word on that one, and we really do need to move on. Uh, Exit polls from the 2020 presidential election suggest that more minority voters, with the exception of black women, voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than in 2016. What do you think that means? And
So,
Nick, it's to
yeah.
you.
Well, I think first we have to contextualize that more people voted for Donald Trump. More people live in the United States. So we're talking about a higher percentage too,
We're
right?
talking about a higher percentage
Yeah.
of that
Right.
demographic.
Perfect.
Yes,
Right.
sir.
So what I think about that is several things. The first thing I said, I think, is it's really problematic for the left because what it says is this guy who has been, I mean, I think at times explicitly racist, right? Who has done nothing but, right, incite racial division in the country, right? Pretty intensely, is getting more support from minority groups, right? And so where does that come from? I think it comes from, I think Bill might have left for a second, but I think it comes from this the ability of the Republican Party to sort of define the Democratic Party as socialist effectively, more effectively than they ever have before. And the reason they're able to do that is because the loudest voices in the Democratic Party, the squad, so dumb, and others, right, are making these really sort of extreme proposals, like defund the police, which is the stupidest political thing pitch I've ever heard in my entire life, right? And then they backpedal and say, no, sorry, exactly what we mean is not what we mean, right? And so so even though the Republican Party is sort of always saying socialist, 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 now the Democrats are actually giving them something to attach to. And what that's doing is it's driving extremely important groups like Cubans in Florida or Mexicans in Texas, right, to see it and to be turned off by it, right? And this isn't necessarily true for all groups at all states. It does vary, but generally, from what I understand, across the spectrum, especially for Hispanic voters, just about almost every ethnicity, from Venezuelan to Argentinian to Nicaraguan to Guatemalan to Panamanian to whatever, voted in higher numbers for Trump. So I think it's a really big problem in that sense. And I think that's a messaging problem that the Democrats really are going to have an issue with if they don't get control of it, because whatever people think, right? So it's more of a political question, I think. And then there's the racial stuff, right? I often think, I think a lot of these cultures, right, especially Hispanic cultures, but even Black culture to some extent, are number one, very religious, and number one, very individual. They base a lot of their pride and their value system around self-determination, right? And I feel like a lot of the rhetoric coming from the left is very victimized. I mean, it is from the right as well, but it's not when they're referencing their specific racial groups, right? So I think that turns people off. I think there's a sort of psychological oppression that comes from the left when you constantly treat people as victims rather than saying, no, you have the ability to do this yourself. You don't need me, the white person, to come and save you, right? You are personally, you can be empowered to sort of accomplish some of these goals too. So I think it's sort of a combination of those two factors and religion a little bit too.
Excellent. Anthony, to you.
So I'm gonna partly agree with Nick that the reason that you partly saw some of this expansion with the voter base, mainly as he said, with men rather than women, is partly because of these social cultural issues and the like. I think that we should kind of. I don't think it's so much like the squad or anybody's in particular any group's particular fault for this. I think it's a combination of factors, like Nick was saying, about culture, religion, that sort of thing. But as far as like what do we need to do to address this, I think a lot of it is this idea that liberals, I don't think so much the left, but liberals are seen to have this bigotry of low expectation. But I think that is a lie perpetuated by the right. And it's been effective because of messaging and their ability to control the narrative on their side, because they are more likely to agree with one another than the broad left in the United States is. The broad left in the United States is divided between liberals, leftists, left of centers, and some culturally conservative but economically liberal people. And when you have broad of a base as that, you're going to have disagreements about what progress looks like, and that causes schisms within the coalition of the left. The right doesn't have that many fissures when it comes to cultural identity in terms of what is and is not proper from a moral perspective, while as the left does. So I think that's something we should probably take into account for this.
Nick, would you care to respond?
I sort of agree with that. I disagree with the fact that we can't specifically identify specific people or groups, because
what I meant was that I don't think you can just blame the squad and just blame defund the police for these issues. I think it's more complicated than that. I was not saying that you can't attribute some of the blame to them from a conservative perspective on this. I just don't think that saying that it is these particular issues is anything that we should be. It's these issues explicitly is the cause of this. As far as like defund the police and stuff, I agree it's a poor slogan, but honestly, I also don't give a shit, because the police need a giant reform, and saying, hey, reform the police hasn't worked in the last 20 years.
So this is what I'll say to that. And I see this on the right too. So a long time for far leftists, and then people who are more center left or less far left, I guess. And similarly with extreme right people and people who consider themselves center right, is that the far right or far left will put out these extreme ideas, and then the more center right and left people will sort of identify that they put out these extreme ideas, say, oh, okay, they're extreme, but I don't really care because they're right, in essence, right? And so what it does is it sort of gives credence to those ideas. And defund the police is probably, I would say, the stupidest political pitch that any person in the history of human existence could ever come up with. And the reason that I say that is because it would never work in any practical sense. It scares the shit out of people. And if you want people to vote, please make them afraid they'll vote. That's why people voted against Trump, right? Fear, not because they loved Joe Biden. And so it's disgustingly stupid, and it's also dangerous, because they actually started to do stuff like that in Minnesota. It fell through, and all those people ended up retracting all of it, right? It never actually happened because it was fucking stupid, right? But so I don't think that, because first of all, the data on police just generally is a little bit skewed, right? The idea that the police are some evil group running around the United States forcefully oppressing everyone all the time, rather than a much more complex situation that has been caused by poverty and not police, right? And police have to spend lots of time in lots of violent situations in lots of violent cities that happen to be majority Black, majority Hispanic, right? Not necessarily because of generational poverty, because of those systemic issues. And then they have more interactions with police, and police are sort of, and because of those, they're all mostly negative interactions. This is the vicious cycle that you get. But this idea that the way to deal with that is by taking money away from the police is just absurd. I mean, it's stupid.
So I think
change it, but don't. Yeah.
I think this is another problem with messaging in general. I don't disagree with Nick that, like I said, defund the police is terrible optics, terrible sloganeering, especially for the United States, which tends to be a little more right-leaning when it comes to law and order. But at the same time, when I said I didn't care about it, it means that I'm not going to harp on this because there's an issue and we need to focus on the issue. I'm not going to focus on the optics of it because I can't change the optics. Not because I'm a white guy, but because I'm not in the movement. I'm not running these organizations. So critiquing them is not going to do anything.
But what if the approach is
one second. The reason that defund the police is seen as badly as it is partly because Republicans use defund to mean abolish. They want to defund the government because they wanted the government to be so small that it can't basically do anything. They wanted to defund the IRS because they don't want the IRS to exist. And they actually move into these directions of defunding these institutions, defunding these objectives in order to actually make it to where they can't do anything. They wanted to defund the EPA because they don't want the EPA to enforce rules on carbon and stuff like that, right? So they want to defund Social Security because they don't want the government to be in charge of Social Security. I'm being broad brush here. I should be a little more clear. Like Tea Party Republicans, people that focus so heavily on the budget, are probably who I'm talking about. Not Republicans in general, not all conservatives, etc. And then finally, I think the narrative for defund is that there are people that want to take money away from police departments, but they don't want to not do anything with it and it goes back into the general budget. They want to take this money, put it into proven systems that actually go and reduce crime. So you can defund the police and actually reduce crime at the same time by investing in social services, getting people more money so they're not as poor, doing things like drug rehabilitation, ending the war on drugs. If you ended the war on drugs tomorrow, that would be a massive defunding of the police structure because you wouldn't be going after drugs anymore and you would not need to have as many police officers on the street to police drugs. So I think doing basically everything that I said is yes, Nick, defund the police is shit, but we need to take into consideration what some of these things would end up doing in that regard.
Okay, so I don't think that you can hold the position that something is politically ridiculous, like you're saying, that you don't think it's a good message because it's bad sloganeering, and also hold the position that it doesn't matter that it's bad sloganeering. Because you believe that the intent is okay. No,
I'm not saying that the intent is okay. I'm saying that I personally can't do anything to change it. So me bitching about it is just a waste of energy.
I personally can't do anything to change racism, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak out about it. Right?
Oh, you can personally do things against racism that will change the people around you in order to do things like that.
But you can personally change. You can personally try to change the rhetoric on the left by doing things around you.
It's not at the same level though. Because
why not?
Because I'm not friends with people like whoever came up with the term.
I'm not friends with racists.
You're not
okay,
friends.
so
we could. I'm not going to say that you're friends with. I'm not going to say you're friends with racist, but I'm sure that there's probably something problematic that's been said that you probably could have corrected on at some point. There's just a difference.
I don't know what that means. So in any event, I think it's absolutely crucial that the messaging on any political issue is effective, because you're not going to get anywhere with a political issue if it's ineffective. So the core to passing political agendas is by making the political message effective, especially in America where people are completely motivated by slogans, right? And when a slogan is bad or a slogan is ineffective, you're going to lose the support that you want. And people had an opportunity at the tragic and totally unjust death of George Floyd. And by saying things like, okay, it's time to defund the police. Now, defund the police might have 75 different meanings, but to everybody who sees that, they think it means abolish. Nobody interprets that as being, well, hold on, this is a nuanced defund. Nobody thinks that, and that's the problem here. It's the messaging. So as much as people want to sort of say, well, it's not a big deal, it doesn't matter, I'm here to tell you it's probably the most important part.
Gentlemen,
just for the last bit.
Let me jump in right
Well,
here.
I just want to say there are people on the left.
We are at time. We are at time.
Sorry.
We do have time set aside, though, for each of you to make a closing statement. Anthony, you won the coin toss. You can go first or you can go last.
I will go last.
Okay, now let me just restate the premise of this debate, just so we have a clear path forward on this closing statement. We have covered a lot of ground today, and there is a lot of ground still to cover. So let me just restate this debate's premise. Has the left gone too far in trying to end racial injustice? And to you, Nick.
So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I feel the same way. I think that I think that gone too far could have been probably adjusted to taking the wrong approach in really sort of counterproductive and extreme ways. I think what the left needs to do is to listen more, stop being. I think it's really, there's this unbelievable arrogance on the left where they think that they've sort of come to sort of some sort of moral epiphany, where they are their beliefs about race are just correct, and that any conversation or deviation, right, that strays away from that isn't simply a disagreement, but it's immoral, and it needs to be eradicated, right? And so I think that the left needs to self-reflect, just like the right does, right? Just like individual people do, right? And to look at themselves and their messaging and their and how they're having these conversations, and to say, it might be possible that there's other perspectives here that aren't motivated by bad intent or aren't bad ideas, right? Just because they're different ideas, just because they don't agree with my particular tribe, right? And so I think that's really important. I think we need to reframe the conversation. I think it needs to be, there needs to be less bad faith in it. I think people need to have respect more for other people who disagree with them, including me. I'm terrible at this, so please. I mean, 85% of the people watching this probably hate me on some level, right? I hope they do, because they should. And I'm kidding, sort of. But like, I think that the approach needs to change. You're not right about everything you say. You're not right about everything you believe. The world isn't, falling into some sort of racial hell, right? We've made a gargantuan amount of progress in the last 60 to 70 years. We should still be judging people based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. We shouldn't have we shouldn't be fixated on the issue of race the way we are, to the extent that we are. Not that we shouldn't have conversations. We shouldn't demonize people who disagree. And I could go on for hours, but sadly, I have to go running. So I'll listen to Anthony, and then I do have to go.
Thank you, Nick. To you, Anthony.
I think that I have made it fairly clear during our roughly 1 hour conversation that I do not believe that the left has gone too far in trying to obtain racial justice. While I have said and agreed with some of the things that Nick has said about optics, it is clear to me, and I think I have made this case, that the left that everybody needs to go further in trying to obtain racial justice, especially in the realm of economic racial justice. Because we as a country, the United States here, for anybody who might be listening overseas, has a giant problem with the amount of wealth disparity caused directly by past racism, because wealth is a measure of generations, not a measure of one individual. And with that, I think that we need to focus in on more of the economic side of the house than we might want, but we still need to go further in other areas as well.
I agree on the economic.
As far as the social aspects and that sort of thing, I think that my opponent has made a decent case for his side. While I don't agree with it, I don't think that he's somebody that's evil for making this point. So I just want to make that clear. Yes. But with that said, I do disagree with him. I don't think that we are demonizing white people because they're white. I think we are, the left maybe in general might be othering or demonizing some people based on their actions, not on the color of their skin. So with that, I yield to Bill to wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for a nice, clean, respectful debate. We covered a lot of ground today. Very well done, both of you. And with that, I'll turn it back to Anthony for a closeout.
All right, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This was the Crowdsource Politics Debates section, and we are going to be doing this more often, hopefully at least once a month going forward, and then once I find time, doing it more than once a month, trying to do it at least twice a month. You can tune in on this on YouTube after the debate, where you can watch it again or share it with your friends to get those algorithms up and, share a good debate, because I feel like this debate was actually really good. And thank Nick again for actually willing to come on to debate this topic. I know that this can be a fraught topic, and it might, leave a bad taste in some people's mouth. So I think Nick should be commended for actually coming on. And thank you, Bill. You are a great moderator, and we should definitely do this again, because I believe that you moderated very well. Thank you.
Certainly my pleasure. Certainly my pleasure.
I will be participating in another debate tonight on Universal Discord's Twitch channel. Universal Discord is a Twitch streamer that focuses in on international policy from a humanitarian non-government worker topic, and they are also focused on indigenous rights and indigenous issues. The topic for tonight is, should a person that hosts a protest be held responsible for what the attendees of their protest do? I have let the moderator, Universal Discourse, decide which position I am taking on this one, because it could go either way for me, and I feel like I can argue both sides pretty decently. So I don't actually know what position I'm on right now. So it's gonna be interesting once I find that out. So again, Universal Discourse, that will be at 7 p.m. Central, so it's 8 p.m. Eastern tonight. That is Saturday the 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central. So I hope to see you all there on Universal Discourse channel. And with that,
thank you, sir.
We're out of time. So as always, keep your head up through the political storm. 1 second.